what kind of got me interested in this is so the whole like discourse around all of these younger voters today, all male voters like voted for Trump and all of it, and it's from all of this like masculine influencers and things. So I kind of was like, all right, well, like, might as well take a look at this. So, um, here we go. Capitalism is a system rooted in competition, domination, exploitation, and division. The system enforces toxic and violent behaviors across the class, gender, and racial spectrum. These behaviors are woven into the very fabric of capitalism and are vital to its success. One of these toxic and often violent behaviors is masculinity. Under capitalism, masculinity, like racism, is a byproduct that is used to further divide the working class. It not only harms surrounding people, but also the individual. Masculinity is not new, nor was it born solely out of capitalism. It is a social construct that we have placed on ourselves, and we can look back historically to understand its rise and work to dismantle it. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx states, humans make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The traditions of all dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Since the rise of class society, masculinity in all its toxic forms has existed. It has helped shape the world we know today. When we discuss Marxist feminism, social reproduction theory, or gender studies, we tend to shy away from addressing the ways in which capitalism also harms cis men as part of the working class. Of course, we know that overall cis men face the least amount of oppression under capitalism, and many aspects of current society are designed for their benefit. However, as we will see, the creation and upholding of the concept and norms of quote unquote masculinity truly only benefit the ruling class at the end of the day. Dismantling capitalist masculinity is essential for total human liberation. So, by men perpetuating toxic masculine traits, they further subjugate themselves to repressive social conditions. They become social police by placing arbitrary definitions of what it is to be a quote unquote man. They actively do the bidding of the ruling class by creating fissures within the class, making it harder to move towards total liberation, something they would benefit from. These traits are also harmful to society as a whole. Of course, there are countless examples of harm that toxic masculinity has inflicted. If you look here at the guy, puffing on his cigar, that's a famous person from Denver. For instance, when Lyden James McLeod, I don't care if I said his name wrong, went on a shooting rampage of Denver tattoo shops in 2021. McLeod had written several books filled with racism and misogyny, regularly posted himself outdoors working out and smoking cigars or shooting his guns. He would rant online about how masculinity was in crisis because of soy boys. The specific male consumer culture, whether it's podcasts or shaving equipment, helps to reinforce these ideas of males in crisis or what it is to be a man. Contrary to popular belief, what we have seen and see acted out as masculinity is not quote unquote human nature and is in fact rooted in material conditions determined by the given modes of production. As Marx said, the traditions of all dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. We are shackled with the zombie like ideas of masculinity, and it is our duty as Marxists to understand these conditions in order to break them down for a better world. So, modes of production, reproduction, and masculinity. In Marxism, understanding what modes of production are and how they shape society is crucial for any analysis. When Marxists set out to understand capitalism and social functions under it, he found that how we organize ourselves and how we produce the means of life determine our existence. From the German ideology, the first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relations to the rest of nature. Humans themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, humans are indirectly producing their actual material life. I know that's a lot, but I'm going to break that down. So, in the first sentence, Marx lays out his starting point for how he analyzes history from a material standpoint. What he is saying is that under human history, we have to look at how individuals lived, how they obtained the necessities of life, such as food, water, and shelter. He claims that we distinguish ourselves from other animals as soon as we begin to produce the necessities of life. And in order to do that, there has to be some type of social organization. By examining history from this standpoint, Marx dismantles popular understandings about human development. For example, that it's human nature for men to dominate women. He shows that the only concrete human nature that exists is our labor and the way that society is organized around it, not eternal male dominance over all. It wasn't until the rise of agriculture and primitive accumulation of goods through shifts in property relations that we see the idea of male supremacy begin to take shape. As agriculture becomes dominant over gathering and hunting societies, social relations begin to change. The family relation began to transform from an egalitarian matrilineal form to an individual patrilineal form. As Engels stated in The Origins of the Family, monogamous marriage came on the scene as the subjugation of one gender by the other, as the proclamation of a conflict between the genders unknown throughout the whole previous historic period. It opened the epoch that has lasted until today, in which every step forward is also relatively a step backwards, in which prosperity and development for someone is won through the misery and frustration of others. As Marx laid out, human production for the necessities of life is what makes us, quote unquote, human. But with production, there has to come reproduction. This does not mean the reproduction of goods, but rather the reproduction of labor in order to obtain those goods. The propagation of the species, as Marx and Engels would say. Social reproduction theory shows how the production of goods and services and the production of life are part of one integral process. Lisa Vogel states, quote, female oppression derives from women's involvement in processes that renew direct producers, as well as their involvement in production. What she is saying is that female oppression stems from the necessities to, quote unquote, necessities to reproduce new labors, and that quote unquote necessity comes out of changes in modes of production and property relations, which we have seen transform from matrilineal to patrilineal. From mother to father, from communal to individual. With the rise of private property and primitive accumulation came the need for inheritance of these things through the male line. Thus, masculinity can trace its roots to the transformation of production and property. All right, divisions of labor. Divisions of labor are not inherently exploitative or oppressive. In fact, it is a process of human cooperation. During early gathering and hunting societies, labor was divided between gathering and hunting. Popular history will tell us it was women who stayed home and gathered and took care of domestic life, while it was the men who went out and hunt. You know, of course, like the men are big and burly and the women are frail and fragile, as you see with Betty and Wilma. However, this is only partially true and is used to prop up patriarchy and masculinity. Modern anthropological studies show that yes, women were predominantly in charge of gathering, but unlike popular belief, it wasn't solely women who did this, and it wasn't out of quote female fragility. Many people in these early societies helped with this task, such as elderly men who may not have had the stamina to hunt anymore. Children, as they grew up, also helped, and men when hunting was may not have been in season or favorable. Women also helped with hunting as conditions were needed. And these early societies, gathering was how the vast majority of food for the group was obtained, meaning that, quote, women's work of gathering was actually vital to survival and therefore placed them in a predominant position in society. Hunting was only a small aspect of these early societies' success. Hunting was time consuming, it was dangerous, and also required a level of technical advancement, such as the creation of perfected and primitive weapons. Um, Biological aspects did play a role as well. As previously stated, women predominantly did take on this labor of gathering due to the fact that they could bear children and were the only ones who could provide early childcare through feeding. Again, this wasn't out of some inferiority of women to men, but rather hunting with a newborn would be difficult and annoying, not just for the mother, but also for the child. Um, so these divisions of labor were crucial to success of early humans. As society began to move away from gathering and hunting to agricultural and animal husbandry, divisions of labor like modes of production and reproduction began to take on alien forms with the rise of patrilineal society and primitive property. In the German ideology, Marx exclaims, at the same time, through the division of labor inside these various branches, there develops various divisions among the individuals. Cooperating in definite kinds of labor, the relative positions of these individual groups is determined by the modes employed in agriculture, industry, and commerce. Parentheses, patriarchalism, slavery, estates, classes. One of these various divisions is masculinity. With the rise of classes came the rise of a dominant class over another, the owning class over the laboring class. Alongside this came further divisions within groups. In the origins of the family, Engels draws the similarities of the house being the factory, the man, the bourgeoisie, and the woman, the proletariat. So one last kind of Marxist theory to go over. So this should help us tie everything together a little bit more before we get to talk shit about Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. And that is the theory of base superstructure. A simple explanation is that the base represents the economic means of production, land, tools, factory, tractors, and the relations to production. Do we own the land? Do we own the tools? Do we own the factory, or does someone else? The superstructure maintains its and legitimizes the base through things like education, religion, family, culture. The base also legitimizes all things in the superstructure. So as the economic base changes through history, tribal, slave, feudal, capitalist, so did the superstructure. How does this fit into masculinity? By understanding what the economic base is, we can examine how we produce and reproduce our daily lives and what our relation is to that production. By understanding this, we can then see how the superstructure is formed and what ideas or structures dominate to legitimize the economic base, for instance, masculinity. Just because the base and superstructure change over time does not mean that old ideas or institutions die off. Like the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. For instance, during feudal times, which would be the base, there was the church, which is a form of a superstructure, who was very prominent in society and shaped the habits of people. The church legitimized the rule that peasants had to farm the land for the royals, who were ordained by God to be in their position. Simultaneously, the church placed social codes on society based on the word of God, such as man has dominion over his wife. It does not state that this is based on the man's class, just that women are to obey the man. The church, however, did not arise from feudal economic base. It was carried over from antiquity and tribal society, albeit different expressions. So masculinity is expressed as a superstructure that legitimizes the base, which today is, of course, capitalism. Because the conception and performance of masculinities relies on the base, there have been changes to what is considered masculine over the centuries as the base changed from feudalism to capitalism. All right, so this is just kind of a little historical overview. Masculinity has taken on different characteristics and expressions over time and carried some of those characteristics over the epochs. Masculinity has always been centered on male supremacy over land, work, the family, which is rooted in how we produce, reproduce, and how labor is divided. However, masculinity's expressions have transformed as modes of production have transformed. And even under those modes of production, it shifts and advances in production or in production as as production transforms itself. So capitalism from the 1900s to 1930s generally was gaining a foothold internationally as the dominant way of business. During this time, capitalism was mostly focused on what was needed to build up infrastructure, establish efficiency in production, with things like electrification of factories, the Green Revolution in agriculture, and Fordism in production. This established the ideas of a mass consumer culture. Masculinity at this time was generally demonstrated as men being the breadwinner for the family, while the wife stayed at home and tended to domestic labor. Men had to exercise emotional restraint as well as show absolute courage regardless of the situation. Men were seen as natural leaders and had the ability to withstand hardships. Economic conditions were extremely hard during these times, so masculinity primarily expressions were through physical forms. Many of these traits have carried on through the decades of today, and that's just a generalization of the time. I'm just generalizing like some periods. From the 1940s to 70s, social conditions due to reductive advancement changed drastically. During World War II, women entered the workplace in massive numbers for war production. This allowed them a level of financial freedom that hadn't been experienced under capitalism like that. However, once the war was over, women were once again relegated to the house in order to fill those positions with male labor. From a capitalist standpoint, keeping the women on would have been better due to lower wages that they paid them, but the fact that they would rather have male labor and pay more shows how deep masculinity runs. During these early post-war years, teenage culture was also established. The civil rights movement brought the question of racial equality to the table. This period is also referred to as the scientific technical revolution, where automation and computers arrived on the scene of production. Being athletic really became a marker of masculinity at this time. Many veterans formed sporting groups to find the camaraderie they missed after the war ended. With teenage culture, sports were a part of the high school experience. This was the cliche jock and nerd times. This was and still is a breeding ground for aggressive and competitive behavior. And today, so from like 1980 to today, the time of neoliberalism once again shifted the productive nature of our society, and this had another transforming effect on our social conditions. Factory production was moved to other countries where corporations were able to exploit cheaper labor and less regulations and oversight. Technologies such as computers and communication made huge leaps that transformed every sector of production, causing even more alienation for workers. Rather than being a producing society, we transformed into a consumption society. Masculinity went from hard hats and sports to podcasts and tech bros. As the contradictions of capitalism become more intense in today's world, the ruling class needs to defend it with more and more vigor. The reality of work in daily life under capitalism today is alienating, degrading, and soul sucking. However, the construction of masculinity says that men should find fulfillment in work, climbing the corporate ladder, and being a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. And if you don't find fulfillment in that and you don't meet those standards, there needs to be an explanation that isn't capitalism. It needs to be spun as your masculinity is under attack and that it's why you don't feel successful as a man. In today's political climate, the attacker is feminism or DEI woke culture, the libs, and political correctness. All of these phenomena are offered as the reason that today's cis men need to prove their quote unquote manliness and quote fight back to preserve their social and material status. The overall superstructure of masculinity with which reinforces capitalism must also therefore be defined by the bourgeois who benefit be defended by the bourgeois who benefit from it. In the German ideology, Marx states, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time the ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than ideal expressions of dominant material relationships, the dominant material relationship grasped as ideas. So, how is the ruling class of today controlling mental production and ideological dominance when it comes to masculinity? Turns out that it's mostly through media, both on and offline. We have all heard the recent chatter about the left needing to find its own version of Joe Rogan. We finally got to this part, guys. In order to counter the harmful narrative being pumped out by the reactionary manosphere, a collection of media outlets and figures that promote misogyny, homophobia, and men's rights groups. Without a class material analysis, the contradictions between what is being billed as masculine, being the breadwinner, having physical dominance over others, etc., and the reality of life under capitalism, working a desk job, living paycheck to paycheck, no time to dedicate to improving oneself, leads many cis men to turn to reactionary ideas for an explanation. Self-help and self-improvement are usually the gateway that bring people into this toxic culture. There are tons of media figures that make up the manosphere, and two of the most prominent are our best friend, Jordan Peterson, and the other dirtbag, Joe Rogan, who are both hosts of extremely popular podcasts, with Joe topping the podcast charts weekly and averaging 14 million listeners per episode, the overwhelming majority of which are cis men. All right, so Joe Rogan, he presents himself as an average dude with average intelligence who is just innocently having conversations with a wide range of people. He bills his podcast as, quote, boundary-free arena that champions free speech. Although he has had people like Bernie Sanders and Cornel West on, it is much more common to see him platforming right-wing conspiracy theorists and conservative personalities such as Alex Jones, Elon Musk, RFK, and Donald Trump. His political influence allegedly helped Trump win the 2024 election, and in 2020, both Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang got some of their biggest donation days after appearing on his show, so his influence is huge. He presents himself as a strong masculine figure who is concerned with working out, young men's health, smoking cigars, and drinking whiskey. Defending masculinity from the woke left is a common theme running through almost every episode. as Marx would say, reinforcing the ideas of the ruling class's dominance. An example of this is Mark Zuckerberg's recent appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, where he explicitly addressed his belief that there is a need for, quote, masculine energy in corporate environments, suggesting that companies have become, quote, culturally neutered by moving away from what they call traditional masculine traits like aggression and assertiveness. He cited his martial arts practice as a source of what made him masculine, saying that beating his male friends up has been a positive experience. On the other hand, Jordan Peterson presents himself as an intellectual and an academic who defends masculinity, Western values, and traditional family structures. To quote from the Denver Communist pamphlet on him, his supporters are those most susceptible to regressive ideology during a time of permanent crisis. He is horrified by feminism and urges men to reclaim their masculinity in order to regain what he sees as their rightful place in society. In Peterson's misogynist conception, masculinity is, quote, order, and femininity is, quote, chaos. He values competition and dominance, hierarchies above all. His worldview is one in which the strong rule over the weak. To Peterson, divisions must be strictly maintained, whether gender binaries, property rights, or national borders. This is the essence of capitalist ideology, and he sees himself as safeguarding it from outsiders and the, quote, woke rabble. Both of these podcasters are active participants in shaping the superstructure of masculinity and reinforcing and strengthening the base of capitalism. These types of influencers and commentators take legitimate issues and concerns that cis men have due to their class position and the alienation forced under the system and directs it into reactionary sentiment that is based on having power over others and in turn reinforcing capitalism. Men often go down the pipeline because they have an investment in maintaining their position in the social hierarchy, and the liberation of other groups threatens that. The version of masculinity that is offered by the manosphere is already different from the version of masculinity that that was considered ideal just a few decades ago. As we have become more and more focused on consumption as a way to express our identities, expressions of one's masculinity also has become more and more focused on what you consume and how you are defending masculinity from the evils of feminism and DEI. Because today's version of masculinity is so reactionary, much of its position as a response to progressive movements around gender and sexuality. Another masculinity influencer worth bringing up at this point is Andrew Tate. Wikipedia describes him as a social media personality, a professional kickboxer, and businessman with 10 million followers. His influence is far-reaching despite a slew of despicable behaviors such as human trafficking, sexual assault, and other forms of violence against women. Tate exploits the alienation of young men by taking their anger and feelings of helplessness and teaches them that dominating others is the cure to this feeling. That's what, as he says, top G's do. A top G is the version of masculinity which revolved around driving fast cars, subjecting women for your pleasure, and the hustle culture grindset mindset. All of these identity markers are outward performances of masculinity as conceived by the manosphere, which again works in defense of capitalist ideas of hierarchy and traditional gender roles. If the ideal version of masculinity presented by these influencers with huge cis male audiences is hyper macho, luxury lifestyle, well groomed, and physically fit, and the reality of most is that they are working their regular ass job with their boss exploiting them and very little to show for it, then capitalism has to do something to mask those contradictions. Rogan, Tate, and Peterson are not simply masculinity influencers who shape the ideas of what is quote manly, and that's all. They also are bourgeois capitalists who use their ideas to sell products, courses, merch, and supplements to their audience of cis men. Tate is one of the worst offenders, offering training courses on accumulating wealth and quote male female interactions. The real world, not the TV show, was one version of the product started in 2022 and explicitly made to target cis male teenagers. It was closed in 2024 due to the data breach and replaced with his current pyramid scheme, the War Room. This group costs $8,000 to join and is described as a quote global network in which exemplars of individualism work to free the modern man from socially induced incarceration. That was a mouthful. Stating it teaches men physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and financial development. It is not just the influencers trying to profit off the alienation and despair felt under capitalism. There are tons of masculinity boot camps available to purchase online. Many of them are centered around physical fitness, modeled around military boot camp, and aim to turn suburban dads into hardened alpha males. One example is the Modern Day Night Project, which cost $18,000 to join. Unlike the War Room, which targets terminally online teenage boys and young men and offers online community spaces, the project is geared towards, quote, entrepreneurs, executives, and leaders. The vision of masculinity that they are selling is not too different from the Tates and Rogans, but they take it offline and focus on physical and mental toughness through a 3-day basic training LARP. It is advertised as a quote 75-hour experience for men who want to live a life filled with fulfillment, purpose, financial freedom, and have a deep, loving relationship with their family. As Marxists, we know that life having no purpose is because capitalism has completely alienated us from our labor, community, the land, and our families. We don't have financial freedom because we are exploited by the ruling class and live our lives according to their whims. Family relationships struggle because of our class position and the way that capitalism sucks everything away from us. Instead of solidarity, class consciousness, and collective struggle, the answer offered by courses such as the project is to go get humiliated by other men while you try to do push-ups in order to claim your masculinity and your rightful place at the top. Even though financial freedom and domination over other genders is what is being sold, all of these pyramid scheme boot camps, secret Discord groups, and online community ultimately won't bring you closer to financial freedom or being a quote top G. At the end of the day, these influencers champion a toxic masculinity that has become a commodity. The things you buy determine how masculine you are, from dude wipes to the War Room. So, my conclusion: there is no such thing as a communist form of masculinity that we can look to or hope for. Saying under socialism, masculinity would look like men being emotional, kind, respectful, any other buzzword you can think of, is utopian and still rooted in bourgeois ideas of morality. As I've shown, masculinity comes out of the rise of class divisions, which is rooted in property relations. As communists, we should not wish to see a new form of masculinity or hypothesize about its characteristics under socialism. We should want to see the end of this parasitic social prison in the same way that we want to see the end of racism, transphobia, and queerphobia. The destruction of the economic base, private property, and capitalism will ultimately destroy the superstructural norms such as masculinity, which is our aim. In 1920, Clara Zetkin and Lenin had a conversation on the women question, which Zetkin later wrote about. At the end of their discussion, they asked, quote, what about the men? Meaning, how do we get them to shake off their antiquated ideas of masculinity? To which Lenin responded, our communist work among the women, our political work embraces a great deal of educational work among men. We must root out the old, quote, master idea and to its last and smallest root in the party and among the masses. That is our political task. It is just as is the urgently necessary task of forming a staff of men and women comrades, well trained in theory and practice, to carry on party activities among working people. We must struggle in our workplaces, our social circles, and our organizations to root out masculinity in all its forms as we know it, to its last and smallest root. Thank you.